run by the Centre for Climate Crime and Climate Justice. We have some stellar speakers with us today, and we may also have some stellar speakers missing, I'm afraid. I'm going to issue a call because I'm not sure exactly who's here. If Walden Bello is here. Is Walden here? I take it I can't hear. We think that Walden is traveling, so he may join us later. Also, Assad Raymond is not with us yet, but hopes to join us at some point. He's in New York. But we have two, really, we're so grateful to the two speakers who we will have up first, we probably couldn't pick better speakers to talk on this topic, speakers with experience of the environmental justice and climate justice movement for virtually the whole time that this agenda has been running, the agenda that we're going to talk about. So the COP, the conference of the parties conferences, which are held almost virtually annually, but not always, to discuss the implementation of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And of course, the next one is in a couple of weeks in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. So we have Vandana Shiva, who I think probably needs very little introduction to people here, but I'm going to give Vandana a quick introduction anyway. An Indian scholar and without doubt one of the world's leading environmentalists, one of the leaders of the global environmentalist movement. As I say, for a number of years, she's particularly known for leading social movements around food sovereignty, including leading the global campaign for organic food, for fair trade, and in particular, supporting struggles and leading struggles in defense of the right to seeds in the face of the major GM companies. She is an intellectual pioneer in the field of and development of ecofeminism and has written more than 20 influential books on those topics. It's such a pleasure to have Vandana with us. It really is.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. We have Hilal Elver, who is also a global leader and expert in international human rights law and in international environmental law. She's been the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, and she currently serves as an appointed member of the steering committee of the high-level panel of experts at the UN World Committee of Food Security and Nutrition. Hilal has the experience of being involved in the movement for a long period of time, and indeed as being a delegate to several COPs, and I'm sure she'll reflect on these. We're really grateful to have you with us, Hilal. And of course, Hilal is a member of the Centre, and we are looking forward to her continued association and work with us. So I think I wanted to say just a few things in reflection of the kind of the theme that we want to develop today, which is kind of the rather provocative theme of what is the point of COP27. And really, I think what we're asking is what is the point of these conferences of the parties in the context of a very, very long process that seems to move backwards almost on an annual basis. And you know, obviously the most famous and most pithy summation of that was made by Greta Thunberg in Glasgow when she marched out of she'd taken one too many greenwashing panels and marched out talking about the blah, blah, blah of those meetings, but really was reflecting, I think, what is a growing feeling amongst civil society and amongst those who are pressuring the conference of the parties from the outside about the futility of this. And look, I mean, this meeting, I know that the audience this is a genuinely international audience, but the meeting has been hosted by us in Queen Mary University of London, and we are, without going into the recent kind of machinations of our government, we have had a government which was planning to open up the North Sea in the midst of, during the COP26 conference in Glasgow. Alok Sharma, who was the cabinet secretary and chair of the conference, was indicating that the UK couldn't justify opening up new North Sea oil and gas fields, and at the same time, behind the scenes, he knew very well that the government was planning that, and that's come to fruition with the issuing of multiple licenses, even before the most recent departed Prime Minister was in power, including the Rosebank field and including the Jackdaw field, both of which are significant sources of fossil fuels. So in that context, it seems that there is a greenwashing element to those COP conferences just domestically, and big questions are also being asked about the Egyptian government and how the Egyptian government will use that the current conference also to give itself a kind of imprimatur of a global leader in this field, and at the same time has a reputation which is unanimously condemned for human rights violations, for violations particularly against protesters. And if anyone read Naomi Klein in The Guardian 3 days ago, the imprisonment of environmental protesters. So big questions about not just the kind of, I guess, the hypocrisy and the contradictions, but if we think about Glasgow, very little has come out of Glasgow. The big GFANs, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, has virtually collapsed, and the big banks 2 or 3 weeks ago began to say that they couldn't be part of the deal because they were worried about potential litigation from third parties. So a series of questions are also raised about the extent to which concrete action is emerging from those conferences of the parties, particularly since we seem to be even further away from the Paris targets. But I think our speakers will talk about this in a much longer term sense, and maybe, you know, we need to think about how far we are away from Rio 1992, because this is 30 years on, effectively, and in fact we're very close to the 30th anniversary of Rio, and maybe that's a good point where I can hand over to Vandana, because I know that she will have some very valuable thoughts to share on that long.
Thank you very much, David, and hello to Hilal, and hello to Richard, and hello to everyone here. I was in Rio, and I was advising my government. And I remember both the treaties that came out of Rio, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, as well as the Biodiversity Convention, were led by the southern countries. The Framework Convention grew in the time where most of the industrialization was in the north, and it's only after WTO and globalization and the project of outsourcing that global corporations based in the West started to relocate. And I've always said, you know, accountability and emissions should be according to economic actors. And if corporations and global corporations are economic actors, then it's their footprint that should be taken into account. But this was the reason that then all of the regulatory framework started to get dismantled. I remember in Rio, 2 issues were constantly brought up. First, that we were not the polluters and the polluters must pay. That was a principle of law laid down. Polluters must pay. The second was, you might remember a memo by the World Bank chief economist of that time, Lawrence Summers, who said that it's better to shift the pollution to the south because life is cheaper in the south. It's cheaper when they fall sick, it's cheaper when they die. And they actually talked about 1 American equal to 10 Chinese and 15 Bangladeshis. My minister in his speech talked about this being the arithmetic of genocide. Sadly, with the new financialization of the Biodiversity Convention and the Climate Convention, this arithmetic of genocide is playing a very big role. Most people think of Paris as the big beginning, but Paris was the end. Copenhagen was the last meeting on legally binding reduction targets. And Mr. Obama, who declared in his peace talk when he got the Nobel Peace Prize, he said if Gandhi was here today, he would declare war because he was sponsoring wars. And then he flew into Copenhagen, did not attend the negotiations, called the now outsourced polluters, China, India, South Africa, I think Brazil was the other one, and the 5 polluters. He said, why do we have to have legally binding commitments? Let's just make voluntary targets. And he walked away. He actually then gave a press conference while the negotiators were still in the negotiating room. And when he said, we've concluded and come to this agreement among 5 of us, Evo Morales, who was then the president of Bolivia, he said, we had come here to defend the rights of Mother Earth, not the rights of the polluters. And I am going to go back and call citizens of the world to write a draft declaration, which then became the draft declaration on the rights of Mother Earth, supposed to be a parallel to the Human Rights Declaration. So Copenhagen allowed the killing of a legally binding treaty. And that's really the only value of an international agreement, legally binding emissions targets. By the time it came to Paris, it wasn't just voluntary, but I wrote my book, Oneness versus 1%, because of what I witnessed in Paris. What I witnessed in Paris was Mr. Bill Gates was calling the shots. He was telling the governments what the solutions were. His solutions were geoengineering. If we messed up the climate, let's mess it up more with putting aerosols in the sky. Genetic engineering, and he was standing with the heads of state on the stage. And I said, something has shifted in power very seriously. The shift of dismantling had taken place in Copenhagen, but the emergence and ascendancy of big money substituting the one country, one vote logic of the United Nations was so much on display. And of course, Hilal will talk much more about the food summit, which was totally hijacked and taken to America, and the Gates person running the Green Revolution in Africa was in charge. So in effect, the UN has been dismembered. And so it's bad enough that a heavy bureaucratic machinery of the UN, which in agreements has a tendency to come to the lowest common denominator in order to have everyone sign on, that even that thin level is now in the hands of the corporations. That to me is the real serious issue of the COPs. Copenhagen was sponsored by Coca-Cola, and I remember when you entered, it said, welcome to Copenhagen. And now the Egypt summit is also again sponsored by Coca-Cola. But Glasgow, they tried to launch all the new jugglery of new carbon credits, carbon offsets, carbon trading. It's not an accident that Mr. Gates is now the biggest farmland owner in America, because he really sees the continuation of pollution and getting offsets elsewhere as the place where the big money will be made in the future. For those of you who've just read the recent report, the World Bank, IMF trap countries in debt. Zambia is in a debt trap. What does World Bank tell Zambia to do? To allow corporations to take over large tracts of land and then take more loans from the World Bank to build dams to irrigate those the corporate land for agribusiness. But the agribusiness now is focusing on carbon trade. So you're going to get massive plantations of exotic species like eucalyptus. And you'll not just turn the land into not producing food, but you will now actually find a new way to add to the profiteering, even during the Kyoto Protocol, which was part of the original UNFCCC. Carbon credits were a big part of the trade system, clean development mechanisms, and the polluters. I remember steel, the Mittal, who's now the biggest owner of steel plants. He continued to pollute with his steel plants, and he walked away with billions more because of this totally fudged credit system. Net zero came out first. The first time I read about net zero was in Mr. Bill Gates' book, How to Avoid Climate Catastrophe. And this book is a recipe of how to continue climate catastrophe. Nitrogen fertilizers are the biggest part of the problem. 1.1 billion tons, more than all the aviation of the world. We worry about aviation, but bigger than that is the emissions from the life cycle of chemical fertilizers. And the nitrous oxide emitted from these fertilizers is 300 times more damaging. I wrote Soil Not Oil in the lead-up to the Copenhagen summit, showing that industrial agriculture is a very big part of the climate problem, and ecological agriculture that regenerates and heals the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle is a big part of the solution. So we know fertilizers are a big problem, and this is what our most brilliant man of the world says: I'm happier than I look. And then he goes on to say, I love fertilizers. Now, someone who can love fertilizers in times of climate change is obviously not interested in healing the planet. Yeah, we don't use tractors on the Navdanya farm. We use bullocks intentionally as renewable energy. He's saying for the bullocks, these are primitive technology that must be made to disappear. This is where the violence against animals is taking place. Animals have been abandoned in India as this targeting of draft animals as if they're waste and you only need milk machines. That too is a part of the problem. So when you talk of crimes, I see the first crime as a crime against nature, denying that the earth used to organize the climate. That's why Jim Lovelock called her Gaia, that the biosphere and the atmosphere are in deep sync. And that's how the climate could become hospitable for us human beings, come down from 290 degrees centigrade to 13 degrees centigrade, 98% carbon dioxide to 0.03% carbon dioxide. It's a crime against cultures who were ecologically sustainable. And the only indicator used in the entire development machinery was, if you don't use fossil fuels and fossil fuel-based chemicals, you're primitive, you're backward, and you must change. You must borrow from World Bank to continuously become part of the fossil fuel system. Then there's a deep crime that those who have not contributed to the harm are the worst victims. The Bay of Bengal, we have had such loss of life and farms and crops. This year, the rains just haven't stopped. Across India, all the crops have been destroyed by monsoon ends in September. We are now in late October and the monsoons haven't ended. That's why I talk about this not as just climate change, but as climate chaos. We know that 1% is the driver of climate change. And the Oxfam study put it so well: the per capita emission gap in 2030 will be 67.7 tons of CO2. And it's 25% higher in 2030 than 1990, and 30 times higher than the global commitments made. And in the study published in Lancet, which took the 350 parts per million as your share, and anything beyond that as basically going beyond your share of the climate sphere, US was responsible for 40% of excess CO2 emissions, European Union 29%, the G8 together 85%, the global north as 92%. So we are talking of a very, very serious form of crime. And then India, it's already shown that, in an extremely bad year, and these are becoming more and more frequent, the average damage is $87 billion. And the entire discussion in the COP is 100 billion. One season, one country, 87 million. So the only way this can work is not by having the polluters get rewarded, but the polluters having to pay. The original principle that was in Rio. The polluters are now rewarding themselves because they are writing the answers. And because of the way this whole issue is linked to debt and to credit, we are going to see more and more takeover of land, of biodiversity, of forests, of water systems in the name of protecting the earth, but actually the biggest resource grab ever. And the Rockefeller Foundation and New York Stock Exchange have launched just before Glasgow. They launched a new natural asset company, companies that will own nature. And they'll do this by getting into places where countries are in debt and saying, here's the money, here's the credit. The BlackRocks will play a role, the Vanguards will play a role. So this crime is a continuing crime. And this injustice, the only way it'll end is in a massive genocide. Of course, climate havoc to me is ecocide in any case. But if the corrections aren't made, and I don't think they will be made in the COPs now, they will be made by people everywhere, and they are protesting, people everywhere coming to common principles of what's a good way to live without dependence on huge energy consumption and huge fossil fuel consumption. And I know, and Hilal knows, that in the field of agriculture, getting rid of fossil fuels is producing more food, more nutritious food, more health, more livelihoods. So the alternatives are there, and these are the ones that get silenced by the big media. These are the alternatives that we must talk about more and more. And if the COP doesn't become the platform, well, we'll have to create other platforms like the one you created, David.
Thank you so much, Vandana. So much to come back to there in terms of both what we need to do and the scale of the problem that we're facing, and also the complicity of the global north, politics in the global north, and the United Nations in this climate chaos. So we're going to certainly come back to those issues. Hilal, I'll pass to you now.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Vandana. Always, it's really difficult to talk after Vandana. She knows about, she's extremely articulate, and she speaks from the heart, not from, also from the brain together. That's very important, because not many people can make this communication heart and the words and the brain together. So she is fantastic making this combination, and her knowledge, her experience, and also her dedication is extremely important. And we are really grateful her leadership in the world of food policies, in the world of environment. That's a really incredible inspiration. You know, the world inspired by this little Swedish girl. We are older to get inspiration, not from her, from Greta, but from Vandana. So what you asked the first question, which is important, what is the point of COPs, right? But COPs are just the international law meetings. And there are many COPs around the world. Every year it's happening, but we don't know and we don't talk about it. But because climate change is extremely popular and extremely directly connected with the people's life, the COPs of the climate change agreement it became global event. So the point is, you like or dislike a United Nations system, civil servants, basically, not only UN civil servants, but also state governmental civil servants. They keep following this years and years. And these are the most boring meetings I ever been entire my professional life. I'm talking about the official side of the COP27 or official side of COP, because as you know, there are variety of places in COPs. You can't, if you're not governmental person, you can't get in certain area, which they do basically negotiations. These are the most problematic parts. Around it, NGOs And now more and more gradually we see the private sector, and private sector is becoming, as you know, in Glasgow, they have been doing huge amount of activities. You think that this is kind of like a trade fair rather than climate change convention, because they were so active. And yes, Glasgow was failure, but all of them were failure. Again, I completely agree with Vandana. Copenhagen really, 2009, I think, really changed the system of the climate change negotiations, because earlier, until Copenhagen, which we have this Kyoto Protocol that was a more mandatory greenhouse gas emission reductions. And at that period, developing countries were excluded from these commitments. Only the developed countries were making this. So that's why United States were not very happy about it, because they will keep saying, oh, China is the big polluter, but they don't do anything. Okay, let's change the system and put every country is developing and develop together, which one of the major principles of the climate change agreement was the common but differentiated responsibilities, just out of a window. So now we all the countries have to do something based on their developmental and their capacities and that. But of course, this means voluntary commitments, and these commitments give certain kind of way to make countries following the rules, but not very strong. If you don't want money, you don't have to really follow anything in the climate change regulation. So basically what they did, they connected this developing countries' commitments with the financing and getting money or not getting money. So it seems to be suddenly in the meetings, mostly they were talking about which country will get what project and they will get what. So it became a kind of negotiation of the money rather than the negotiation of the principles of the climate change. What is the climate justice, for instance? Every year when we meet, basically is November, December. It's generally end of the seasons, hurricane seasons, and there's always important disasters around the world. Now, just recently we experienced in Pakistan is unbelievable kind of disasters. 1/3 of the country is underwater, and 33 to 35 million people are located from one place to another to survive. So what happens? Is this going to be a kind of remedy? I'm sure there are lots of developing countries will talk about it, especially Pakistan, as keep saying. But as you know, this the pledge of the money, the 100 billion never been delivered. Now they say, oh, 85 million were delivered, but which kind of project they delivered, we don't even know. Basically this, as Vandana says, carbon trading, because carbon trading is very lucrative, but it is very important connection with the food security issue. So if we come back again, COP27, as you know, Egypt is not really democratic country. There are many countries that they were not democratic enough that they wanted to host COPs. This is a kind of way of making national pride PR of the country. As you remember, last year in Glasgow, UK used Glasgow as kind of post-Brexit kind of sensational new UK. Although it didn't work that way, but they were using this. In Egypt, they are using this kind of how climate friendly they are. You know, they make organizing electrical buses, and they put a lot of solar systems. But these are completely window. And then if you look at if you go to Egypt next year, early January, you're never going to see any of them. So we know that every country did this. So it's an unfortunate situation, but the United Nations gives opportunity to every countries that they make this kind of hosting COP meetings and making their advertisement as much as they can, some kind of like, the equality, anybody would go and take it. So now the civil society is pushing hard that Egyptian prisons are full of people with civil society people in jail trying to take out them. Even environmentalists are. Most of them are political prisoners. And it's going sort of parallel what is happening in the climate change. I don't know if it will be helpful. Hopefully it will be helpful for people do. But what is another issue right now in this year will happen. We are in the middle of a serious crisis, as you know. I am here in Rome. It's in the Committee of World Food Security plenary. This plenary was completely collapsed because of this war on a war in Ukraine. You will say why it's so important, or what would be the impact of the United Nations organizations cannot anymore focusing on their work, because two major global players or geopolitical players are fighting right now. So some little words, two words actually, was able to collapse the whole system. One is the war, the other one is the sanction. So one country, which Russia, doesn't, they want to include economic sanction in the writings, and Ukrainians and the followers of the Ukrainians are trying to make it, this is a war, it is not something else. So because of this fight, unfortunately, the plenary cannot make the final recommendations. So I am not hoping, but I am worried that will be the same thing in Egypt. It's going to be hijacked by this very important event, important conflict, because it's very much connected with energy crisis right now. It's very much connected with the climate. You cannot really make the distinctions. You cannot talk about it, climate change, without talking about the energy crisis, especially in Europe. You'll know in Europe is waiting for a serious kind of winter, and energy crisis, prices are very high, inflations are very high, and food prices are high because Ukraine and Russia is responsible 30% of the food trade. You can say why 30% of food trade is so important. It's important because all the food insecure countries are taking their wheat. Basically, wheat is a major food staple, comes from these countries, and fertilizer is extremely important for industrial agriculture, like Vandana talks about it. No one talks about it. Is it really important for fertilizer to feed the world? No, nobody talks about it. They only talk about the fertilizer prices is extremely high. So if you cannot buy fertilizer, you cannot produce. All the remedies solving food crisis right now is based on production issues. Actually, the problem of the food is not about a lack of production. We know this, but the lack of justice and accessibility and the food prices. So now in the world, when we are talking about serious impact of the food, fertilizer, finance, still existing COVID and broken global supply chain, I don't think so. The COP27 will focus on significantly on climate change policies. The problem is since the war started, including United States and UN, big kind of commitment of this climate net greenhouse gas reduction, they try to think about the changing their policy. So they are trying to say, oh, we should really cannot go out of cannot go out of energy fossil fuels because we need a financial problem. Even they try to go back to the nuclear or go back to the fossil fuel. So the climate policies are in the middle of the changing right now. So what they're going to say in COP27, I'm very curious, because this is 6 months ago would have been very different. But in the middle of the crisis of Ukraine, which seems to be it will go further, many of the commitments will be significantly revised. Hopefully not. But so what I'm trying to say, the geopolitics of the climate, energy, and food will hijack completely COP27. Besides the Egyptians' non-very democratic politics, a lot of civil societies cannot even access. That would be another issue. The corporations are taking every year more and more space that civil society is losing, because civil society is having a serious problem of getting funding. As you know, during the COVID period, everything is disappeared. Now they are convening again with big time money, especially in the climate change. Now big agricultural companies, which not more than 4 or 5, and also their subsidies and subsidiaries and national versions, they all are there. Bill Gates, of course, that. And I'm very impressed by Vandana. She did read Bill Gates' books. I don't know how did she do without getting angry and frustrated. And I wasn't able to touch even that book, because I know what he's trying to say. And the much more serious one, people are listening him. So that's a kind of serious problem, especially in the food policies. He loves fertilizers, as Vandana thinks. Without the fertilizer, without the innovation technology, we really cannot feed the world. Actually, feed is the world is feeding itself if they don't interfere. I mean, that's a kind of very sad reality that still we have been talking about in the United Nations. Let me stop here, and if there is any question, we come back again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hilal. I mean, there will be questions, definitely. That was a really crystal clear analysis, both of the general long-term situation, but also the particular geopolitical moment that, as you say, is going to overshadow the Sharm el-Sheikh discussions. I'm quite sure Vandana did get angry when she read Bill Gates's book, but she can maybe come back and confirm that in the questions. And both of you, thanks for really, I think, summing up, you know, what's going on here, and what the point at which we're at is that, in Vandana's words, the polluters are now writing the answers to the point that they are also in control of increasingly the land grabs and the resource grabs that are being extended, and of course those market solutions have been kind of intensified in ways that allow corporations to be absolutely central. That's not just empirically when you actually go to these COP events, but it's throughout the whole world system. And I think both of you, I thank you for your very, very clear analysis of the state we're in at the moment. And on that, I will pass over to questions. I do want to say that we're recording this, so if you don't want to be recorded, please make it clear before you ask your question, and we'll make sure that you won't be on the final. You won't be on the final edit. I also want to say we've heard from Walden, and unfortunately he's stuck at an airport. That's why Walden Bello is not with us. But I assure this audience, and to give Walden an opportunity, we will include him in a future event certainly, because given his analysis again of the geopolitical situation, we would really want to hear from him at some point, maybe after the COP event. In the meantime, I'm going to pass over to the audience for any questions. You can either put your hand up or shout if you can't put your hand up, or post your question in the chat. Can I see any questions from anyone? I have a question from Zoom user. I'm afraid I can't see your name, Zoom user, but
is that me?
That's you, yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm Nicholas Watts of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, and I chair the Independent Forum of Commonwealth Organizations. I'd be particularly interested. Liz Truss, our sort of ephemeral Prime Minister of a few days, told King Charles, who is also head of the Commonwealth, that he couldn't travel to Sharm el-Sheikh. Now, there are mixed feelings, obviously, for those of you, as you mentioned, who have read Naomi Klein's piece in The Guardian last week about human rights abuses of environmentalists at Egypt. So I have two questions, really. One is, if he could go, should he go, and should any of us go to Sharm, given the human rights context, and what protections do we expect to be offered to civil society participants? And the second question is mainly to Vandana, because the Commonwealth, 56 nations now and 24 small island states, a number of which are due to disappear. What suggestions do you make for enhancing the Commonwealth standing and contribution in this context? Can Commonwealth nations be expected to work as a collective, as they did largely in Paris and in New York for the Paris Agreement and the SDGs, and notably failed to do in Glasgow when India came in to block the exit from fossil fuels at the very last minute? And those of us who saw Alok Sharma on the verge of tears at the very last minute there were seriously moved. Is there scope for the Commonwealth and for India to make a major impact, well, and for India to change course?
Well, I don't think small countries, the island nations or the mountain regions, fail. I think their voice is silenced, yeah, which is two very different things. Mm-hmm. Because, like I said, the South was leading the formation of the UNFCCC, but really the interim period, it was the small island nations who were the conscience of the world. I remember the Philippines environment minister after the big typhoon talking about how this was about life and death, and his role was not just as an environment minister, but a keeper of his culture and his society. Yes, you know, I think we have an opportunity that the British Empire connected us through empire, that we can use those bonds to unite as true commonweal, the true Commonwealth. And what is the Commonwealth? A planet that is secure, a planet where people are not being washed off their islands. I mean, in the Bay of Bengal, the Sundarbans, constantly losing land. In the Himalaya, our glaciers are melting. I think what we need to do together is a truly authentic scientific consensus among the people who are impacted. And that's where the Commonwealth as a union can play a very, very big role. And also, no matter what we do, the damage will not be, the momentum of the destruction is high, and there will be massive displacement. And that's where the issue is not just finances, the issue is homes for the displaced. And I think the Commonwealth could create a new culture of creating homes for the displaced. We used to call it refugees. But now we have Foreign Minister of the European Union who gives a speech that Europe is a garden and the rest of them are in a jungle. Well, our forests, our farms are like forests, and jungles for us are the highest evolution. He actually said that. He said, Europe is a garden, and the rest of the world lives in a forest, in a jungle, and they will invade us. They will invade our garden. Now, that kind of sense of siege by those who have devastated the planet is, to me, the ultimate climate crime. And it's the ultimate crime against humanity. So I think, yes, the Commonwealth Union could play very creative and different kinds of role than how they got bonded together. And for Prince Charles, I'll let Hilal try and answer. I think it's a bit strange that a prime minister tells the king what he should do. That's a bit strange. It's upside down.
Can I, before Hilal answers, can I also kind of focus the question, because it was about Prince Charles, but it was also a more general question: should we go? And I do want to broaden out. Maybe Vandana would want to come back on this after Hilal, but this was a big question in civil society. It has been for the last few COPs, but particularly after Glasgow. Should civil society organizations be wasting their time and energy? And that's maybe selfishly a question that we set out to answer when we were thinking about this theme. So should we go? It was the question.
Well, my answer is this. Of course, it is. I'm not in a position of anyone else's decision. But what happened in the September 2021, there was a food system summit, like Vandana mentioned. It was organized by World Economic Forum and the UN Secretary General together. It was a fait accompli. This summit about the food system, and NGOs and civil society was not included in the first place, and they didn't want to go. They completely sanctioned, and they decided, we vetoed to go, and they organized their alternative meetings. That's one way to get attention. At the same time, because the climate change is a big event, I am sure there are many civil society organizations following the general ideas of the Bill Gates. They get a lot of money from Bill Gates. There are NGOs that are perfectly happy with what is happening right now in the world, and they will go. So in this case, not going there as a kind of alternative voice, maybe losing some opportunity. What Neil King doesn't go, I think that's more problematic issue, I think, comes from his mother. There was a problem, I think, this Palestinian policies, maybe, or many head of states, in order to escape the political side to show, they says, oh, we don't have enough security, so we don't go. For instance, Turkish president in Glasgow last minute said that, oh, I don't go because there is not enough security, because maybe he didn't want to be there, was kind of not to be together with the NGOs that didn't think that it was a kind of proper place for him because of his climate policy. So that's why it is easy to say, oh, I don't go because there's not enough security. I don't know what the king's decision, so I am not a citizen of neither UK or nor global Commonwealth. So that's, I give you to person that asked this question, maybe he has answer already and he tried to make it rhetorical. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilal. I think we'll move on before I launch into an invective about Charles not being my king either. But there we go. And I mean that from both a Scottish independence perspective, but also as from a perspective of a British citizen who sees the British system collapsing at the moment. Let's move on. Assad has got a great question. And I'm going to just read out, because I think the Assad Farouk has got a connection issue, so I'm going to read out the question from you, Assad, if that's okay. While we recognise the role of climate change in the floods, we also understand how massive water infrastructure has been creating the floods. The floods are as much a crisis of drainage consequent to this water infrastructures as of climate change. As such, sometimes the larger debates on reparations, loss and damage ignore and sometimes silence this kind of local understanding. As such, what are your thoughts on how to both support reparative claims by the government of Pakistan, but simultaneously trying to ensure that local communities are at the front and center of those conversations? Vandana.
I totally agree, Assad. 3 of the disasters in my regions in just the last few years, they weren't just extreme events. Extreme events in stable ecosystems don't kill people. Extreme events in destabilized ecosystems with highway building, destroying the drainage channels, with dam building, basically the concrete, empire of concrete, they aggravate every problem. 2 years ago, there was horrible cyclones in the Bay of Bengal. But the flooding that did not, when it comes through rain, there's natural drainage systems, it goes away. But when the irrigation systems and the dam canals were broken in order to release the waters, that's the water that stayed. That's the kind of water that is sitting in Pakistan. So it is a maldevelopment disaster on the ground level, and added to it is the maldevelopment at the planetary level. No climate event by itself destroys. We lost 20,000 people in 2013. The combination of heavy rains, a glacial lake bursting, but more importantly dams being built and being blasted through the mountains. And when this flood came, it took all that machinery, it took all that debris, the river level rose up by 40 feet, villages were washed away, roads were washed away. We have watched how the dams combined with the climate damage make it the true disaster. And then last year, in the home of Chipko, the movement that has been my inspiration in my university, in the home of Chipko, they were building dams, and a glacial melt took place, carried that dam away with 200 people. So yes, the voice of the grassroots, because it's the only true voice of the harm, is the only true voice of maldevelopment and the climate extremes, because they are the ones who, through their suffering, are the ones who know the corruptions that went in and every dam. I'm sure it's the case for Pakistan too. In India, the big debt for dams is what piled up as a structural adjustment in 1991. So the World Bank gives you loans to make dams when we have the most sophisticated systems of ancient irrigation, where it's a round river. You never take water away to create waterlogging and salinization. You always bring the water back. And all of those systems of indigenous knowledge ignored to build giant-sized structures for profits and to have repayment. And until we start to connect what happens to the land with externally imposed models of development and how that makes it all more vulnerable in times of climate disasters, that combination is what only the local people will be able to tell you. Thank you, Assad, for bringing it up. And have a good trip wherever you're going.
Hilal, did you want to respond on this question?
Just a little adding what Vandana said. Actually, it's very important. The dealing with the local problems with the local knowledge. It's very difficult to explain them in the global meetings or World Bank, IMF, FAO, all the scientists that they talk about the science and innovation is going to solve all this problem, just only let us doing on our own. But unfortunately, if you look at the last 20, 30 years, what they have been doing, especially World Bank, was wrong because the traditional knowledge knows because they've been living there thousands of years. They know when water is coming from where. They know how to stop the water. They know how to leave places. So when we deal with the technology, technophiles, we have to be very careful because they do more good than the damage. This means the climate justice is important. Disasters are happening everywhere. I live in Santa Barbara, as Vandana knows, one of the most sophisticated cities in the United States. We had a very important climate disasters a few years ago. First, it was drought after drought, the wild fire, 5 weeks, and then there was a huge rain, and the rain comes with that kind of disaster. You know, it was important. 24 people died, and in 2 weeks, we didn't even know there was a disaster there because only 2 weeks they rebuilt everything, including highways and bridges. But if you look at what's happening, let's say Puerto Rico, still they are suffering. So that's a very important distinction between the poor neighborhoods and the rich places, and where money comes, where it goes. Number one, local knowledge. Number two, the financial capacity really would answer the natural disasters. Otherwise, it's very difficult to resolve these issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Hilal. I'm going to go to Tiago Jesus, who works at QMUL in the People's Palace Project, and Tiago also has a bad connection, so I will read out Tiago's question. In Brazil, indigenous territories comprise 13% of the country's land, and 80% of Brazil's biodiversity lives within these protected territories. Indigenous communities have stewardship of these lands, and we are now seeing several corporations stroke organizations trying to bring these communities into the carbon credit market, arguing that this will generate substantial income while preserving these community traditional ways of living. I think one example that I have come across is that there are bonds that are now being issued by local organizations, and that's been a controversial issue. So what do you think of this movement, Vandana?
You know, I have called it carbon colonization, and the smaller countries in Glasgow also called it carbon colonization. First, it's wrong because the value of biodiversity is much more than the value of carbon on a very shady trade system. Its functions are much more. And at least my life's work has shown that by and large, the economies of biodiversity through the indigenous cultures and local economies actually has a much bigger contribution when you have the ability to count all the contributions. But the second reason why this is wrong is because I know with it will come policing. To say that this kind of carbon trading system will allow indigenous cultures to remain in their culture. No, the minute you financialize that culture, their values, their organizing will go, and they'll be hooked to the global financial system, which, as we know, beginning with the 2008, the 1930 crash, now the 2008 crash, we know it is not a stable system. It's a highly unstable system. And today, the indigenous people will be told you'll get $20, but we are going to measure every tree, every bit of your soil. We'll have the satellites in the sky. We will do all that monitoring. So you'll have to become part of a surveillance system in order to participate. But today, $20, tomorrow it might be $2, and then it might be worth nothing. So to project, to take all of this amazing billions of years of biodiversity evolution, thousands of years of the living cultures, and take an instrument that has repeatedly failed nature and society and put it as the only measure available, I think it is carbon insanity.
Thank you. Hilal.
It is a fantastic answer. I can't even put in one word.
Okay. So carbon insanity seems to be the watchword of a lot of the, yes, please, Vandana.
Yeah, I mean, for those who might think I'm just using words carelessly, when I use strong words, I use them very thoughtfully. If I see these corporations as criminals, of course they are performing crimes against nature and humanity. But this language of decarbonization that Mr. Gates floats around, you can't decarbonize a living world. Everything of life is living carbon. Life is based on the molecule of life, which is photosynthesized through the green leaf. And to equate, first to deny living carbon and reduce everything to fossil carbon is the first blind spot. And the second blind spot is to then further destroy more of that living carbon, which is a climate solution, because the only climate solution is taking that carbon dioxide that is accumulated in the atmosphere, allowing the plants to fix it and put it back into the soil, of course, stopping all the new emissions, to then basically say none of that matters. And all I will measure is, I had to debate a person called Mark Carney. He used to be the chief of the Bank of England. He was appointed by the UN as their big climate finance person. And in this debate, he said to me, oh, we've got all the plumbing in place. It's just that the land for the offsets is missing. And I told him, I said, we are not your offsets. You deal with your pollution within your place. You cannot colonize us again now to carbon. Yeah. So I think that we'll have to be much more vigilant on the carbon issue. Also, because most people don't know that Monsanto and Bayer have joined up with Gates, because Gates is now pushing fake food. Using the climate scare, he's now saying the only way to save humanity is eat fake food from the lab. People think it'll come from nowhere. Fake food in labs will need feedstock. Bayer is talking about only giant corporations on very giant land holdings producing raw material of carbohydrates and protein to feed plant-based fake food. So all of this, they have structured together. What we need to put together is the knowledge and wisdom of indigenous cultures, our common humanity, and our common sense.
And local control, as you say,
course.
rather than externally imposed solutions. So thank you, Vandana. Before I go to the next question, I just want to flag up that we have a sign up for the Centre for Climate Crime and Climate Justice for future events. If you want to be on our mailing list, Angela's just posted a link in the chat just above Shobana's question. So please go to that link and sign up if you want to hear more from us, and I hope all of you do. Shobana Iyer has a question. How do we best support NGOs and the media to provide the correct information? I think I'll go to you, Hilal. Big question.
Well, but it's a very good question, because NGOs are doing extremely important job. If there was no role of NGOs in civil society and the democratic system that allows them to act, it's we can't get all the information outside of the UN doors. That's not possible. So that's a very, very important thing. And because of the financial crisis, because of the free market system, not many countries are supporting NGOs, because it used to be maybe European NGOs supported by the governments. Now this is less and less kind of possibility. So we all, as a responsible citizens, one way or another, either with our works or with our time to giving them, or if it is possible, even the small donations, just to make the responsible NGOs, also accountable NGOs, should be in the working environment with the private sector, especially because they are extremely powerful, financially very, very situated themselves, very good, and the governments somehow believe that the solutions comes from the private sector. So that's why the role of NGOs and the people's voice, this is the only way we can make the alternative voices. You know, there is an alternative production methods, there's an alternative climate technicalities. So without the independent scientists, which is very, very important, and the independent NGOs, we can't really make this. And also independent academics and universities. These are the places that are still available, hopefully in a democratic societies.
Thank you. Vandana?
Well, you know, we were talking about local organizing, and grassroots civil society actually works on a very low cost level, because the direct connection with communities substitutes for huge amounts of expenditure. So I think people need to find now new creative ways, because I've seen the attack on civil society grow hand in hand with globalization and corporate control. They would like a world where there is no independent voice, and they would like universities where there is absolutely no independent academic. So we have to reclaim all the spaces that they're trying to close, and we have to find new ways. Even as the old ways, they try and shut the door for us, we have to find new ways to connect, to have solidarity, and we need to create regenerative solidarity economies at the local level, which are resilient, and solidarity systems to support the work that is vital.
Thank you. I can't see any other questions in the chat. Does anyone here have any questions they want to put to our speakers? If no one is going to do that, I am going to do that. That sounds like a threat, but I will ask. I'll ask a question I think that gets to the heart of what we've been talking about. It does seem that the UN Framework Agreement on Climate Change has consolidated at this stage only market solutions to problems that have been created by the market. That's an oversimplification. But if we think about the various forms of carbon trading that have been consolidated in this agenda, if we think about the net zero agenda, and if we think about the various kind of financial responses, they are all market responses which enable new markets to grow and which produce the basis for sustainability only in market terms. And I think for me, if we come back to the COPs, I mean, the Glasgow meeting, probably net zero was at its high point. Vandana said earlier that she'd come across this term from the Bill Gates book, which I think was only 2 years ago or so, 2.5 years ago. And of course, we had a debate about about carbon neutrality for a long time. But this term net zero really permits the ongoing production of fossil fuels. That's what it does, because it says you can continue to produce fossil fuels if you offset or if you neutralize in particular ways, or even if you spend your money that you make from fossil fuels on renewables, right? So I suppose my question is a bigger question, a more difficult one, which is, to what extent do we really need to deconstruct this market and make that our primary focus, the kind of market rationality that stands behind the solutions, or is that too abstract? Should we do that just by concentrating at a very local level with local solutions?
Now,
Which
I
one?
think,
Okay. Go Vandana first.
we definitely need the experiences of the local level and their local solutions. But I think those of us who work at more than the local level have an obligation, have a duty to deconstruct the structures that have been made to look like they are permanent, inevitable, when they're very, very recent. For me, colonial commerce is the beginning of the market domination and extractivism. And we have to start seeing parallels, that not only is the climate regulatory framework being dismantled as regulation and being turned into a new market opportunity for the polluters. If you look at what's happening with the Biodiversity Convention, exactly the same is happening. Read the Dasgupta report. They're all talking about taking nature, turning it into a financial asset, or taking pollution and turning it into a financial asset, and then just trading fictitiously in a casino that constantly comes to a halt every few years. So I think our focus has to be on financialization of nature as continuing the marketization and commodification of nature, and definitely the pseudo market solutions that are being offered. And that's where I think what Hilal said about true independent integrated sciences, interdisciplinary sciences, working with the knowledge of local communities, that partnership is the partnership which will find a different path. We have to make enough of a resonance amongst ourselves to silence, these few people who just get into a room or get into World Economic Forum and generate a solution, and then get all the governments to come on board by giving $1 million here and maybe a flight ticket there. So those of us who are still a bit independent in our thinking and our activism, we do need to join hands to create another vision, another world that we can imagine, and the links to that world by actual actions that people take.
Well, I can add some little things to this. As you know, the human rights principles or human rights-based approach is a kind of limiting the power of markets. So how do we protect people? Through the principles of the human rights. So the climate change agreement was not very familiar about the human rights principles until 2010, 2011. And then gradually they understood, for instance, they put the climate justice in the preamble, they put the right to indigenous people and women's rights, all the preamble, but it's not the operational part, but just the preamble. You find some kind of human rights language finally in the climate change reports, because the framework convention cannot to be changed. That's already 92. You cannot include and exclude anything. But in the every COP, they have this COP rules and principles. For instance, Glasgow principles. It will be Sharm el-Sheikh principles. In this process, they put here and there some human rights because they wanted to please the NGOs, and some countries like Bolivia or Nicaragua, some independent small countries were pushed to human rights. So that what could be, if you look at the perspective of human rights, then you have to make the limitation of the power of market, unless states are responsible. If the states don't protect human rights principles, there is no way for protecting people against the powerful way of doing all this scientific and economistic and the financialized system. The system is going more and more to that direction. Of course, speculation is very important. So the only way we have to trust the human rights principles and find the government that are friendly to implement them, to regulate them, so you can protect the vulnerables. That's the only way.
Thank you, Hilal. I have one more question. I think we'll take one more question, and that's from Zoom user. Can Zoom user read the question out? It's not Nicholas, who was our earlier Zoom user. We've got a second someone with the same name. So would Zoom user would like to ask the question, or should I ask on your behalf?
I wrote another question.
It's you, Nicholas. Okay, yeah,
No,
sure, fire ahead.
I'm just wondering, because I think the countries of the North have clearly failed to hold to account ecocidal heads of government, such as Bolsonaro, and I'm wondering, how can citizens and countries of the South best hold to account the BRICS leaders, sort of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, currently supporting or engaged in ecocidal activities? I think South Africa I wouldn't include Ramaphosa in that, although the South African infrastructure and environment is currently appears to be falling apart. But I think Modi and Bolsonaro, Xi Jinping, Putin need somehow to be held to account.
Thank you. Any responses?
I have one thing that I disagree with, kind of making the countries in the South are much more responsible, all kind of ecocidal activities, if I am understand correctly, because the countries in the South is somehow needed some kind of developmental activities, and the North capitalism and the corporations are pushing them to do something against nature or against human rights. So I don't think so only we have to hold responsible the countries in the South and leadership in the South. It's a very responsibility of entire global community. So it has to be some certain kind of accountability for everyone to stop, if you really want to stop that kind of state criminal activity, because there is behind the scene a lot of activities are going on, or negotiations going on. So that's even the Bolsonaro, I'm not definitely legitimizing Bolsonaro, but any kind of even the anti-democratic leadership, they have to have a certain kind of connection with the big corporations or the big power behind it in order to do that, because they want to be the growth high, and they want to be the big economic player. So they are pushed by the global economic order to do this thing. So I think all countries, all powerful countries, and all powerful corporations should be accountable to stop it, this kind of ecocidal, genocidal activities. I
Totally support Hilal.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say that I wouldn't disagree at all with Hilal, but I was just thinking that voices from the South may have more traction in the intergovernmental sphere at, say, COP27. But
I think we've got a very similar, thanks, Nicholas. I think we have a very similar kind of point and question coming in from, I did say that was the last question, but I'm just gonna make this the last question, because Sharvi has put a question in the chat. Do you think India, other such developing nations, owing to their place and position in the Global Forum, have a greater responsibility to push for equity in the climate treaty? I think it's a similar question, really. I think Hilal's probably, unless you wanted to add anything, Hilal.
No, I don't want to add anything. I think Hilal has responded to this question as well as all others, that we have to look at the most powerful governments and the most powerful corporations, who then manipulate everything else for their agenda. And you know, we just have to become more politically savvy to understand the structures of power.
Yeah. Okay, that's fantastic. And look, I have to say the analysis that we've had today has been crystal clear and setting out, I mean, not only a whole series of approaches that we need to take, which are not being taken at the moment, but I also kind of have in mind, yes, we need to feed ourselves, and we can feed ourselves, going back to the discussions about food, but we also need to feed ourselves with an understanding of exactly what's going on at the moment. And that's what we've done today. And although there may not be easy solutions, we have discussed a whole range of ways in which we can make the world a better place, and create another vision and another world, to paraphrase Vandana. So I'm really grateful to both Hilal and Vandana for setting that
Thank you.
vision out, really, really. And we'll have you back if you want to come back. Hilal will be involved in the centre anyway as a member, but Vandana, we would love to have you back at some event in the future if you would come back. And we just had a message from Asad Raymond from War on Want, who couldn't get out of the session in New York. He was in to join us. And of course, Walden was stuck at the airport. We will have them both back in a future event. And thanks to everyone. I also want to say thanks to Richard, who helped set this up, and also to Gulsh and Angela, who also helped organize this event. It's been a real team effort, and I'm really grateful. And I hope that we see all of you at an event very soon. We've got a face-to-face event on the 9th of December. We've not released the details about it, but it's going to discuss West Papua and the current demand for a green state plan. And we're going to be looking at the relationship between state violence there and the defense, environmental defenders, and also the defense of a new vision, a new environmental vision. So if you sign up for the mailing list, we'll get the details of that to you on the 9th of December. Until then, or until the next event, thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Vandana. It was lovely. Thank you.